Good morning. My name is Andre Roux from the IFR, and with me today in a conversation is Doris Viljoen, a senior researcher from the IFR. The topic, not surprisingly, has to do with COVID-19, the so-called coronavirus pandemic. We want to focus particularly on South Africa and the possible prospects given COVID-19, what it might mean for the short and the medium-term future of the country. I think by now most people are aware, obviously, of the pandemic and all the lockdowns, etc. As we enter day one of the second phase of the lockdown, it might be worthwhile starting off, Doris, by having a quick look at some of the, let's call it, demographic features and realities of South Africa. What is the population and what is the nature of the population subject to this awful virus? So Doris, maybe just, as I say, a few basic features of our demography, of our population composition, etc. If you'd like to perhaps comment on that.
Yes, sure. I'm going to show a picture or two on a slide. So I'm going to share a slide or two so that we can sort of understand a little bit better what's going on. So here we see some of the projections done by the United Nations Population Division, and the different colors are the different age groups. And we see that we have significant numbers that was increasing dramatically of the 0 to 19 age group. That is sort of plateauing going on, but we have significant number of younger people. Our second biggest lot of people is the age group 30 to 59, and then lower numbers of 20 to 29-year-olds and 60 and older, but increasing. So we have a very young population, but we also have quite a poor population. People in South Africa are actually quite poor. I have another slide of that. Let me quickly get it for you. There we go. We can see that in South Africa, we have more than half of our population living under what is called the upper bound poverty line. So we have significant poverty, and that goes along with people living in less than optimal housing and facilities with very limited access to water and basic services. We see that in the data that comes from our social progress index, where the red dots indicate where we are really falling short, where the assessment regards that as a significant weakness. And then stuff, especially in relation to our potential handling of a health crisis, stuff like nutrition and basic medical care, that is a red dot. And then water and sanitation is significantly weak as well. And then access to basic knowledge, in other words, information being shared, basic environmental quality, health and wellness. Those are the things that sort of build up. It's the stuff that we had before the crisis was here. It is the stuff, it's our sort of our things that we had before. And that probably is going to sort of make the handling of this significantly more complex. I'm sure you have views on that and how this would play in going forward, especially from an economic perspective, Andre.
Yes, in fact, let me take you and have a look at just a few very broad, if you like, economic issues, which link up very nicely with what you've just said. I just want to start off with a few thoughts about the global situation. The well-known analyst Muriel Robini had this to say a couple of weeks ago. The shock to the global economy has been faster and more severe than the 2008 crisis and even the Great Depression. And towards the end of this quote, all of the things that happened during the Great Depression took around 3 years to play out. In the current crisis, similar outcomes have materialized in 3 weeks. In the last few days, we've seen the IMF forecasting global growth in the advanced economies of -6% for this year. The World Trade Organization sees trade plunging by 32%. They also call this the worst recession in our lifetimes.
Mm.
So one of the major features so far is that the recession, and there's no doubt a recession lies ahead, is a synchronized recession. All parts of the world, rich, poor, big and small, are going to suffer some kind of recession. Let's have a look at South Africa. One could argue, and this resonates very nicely with what you just said, Doris, that scenario, or the scenarios, the future scenarios for the country in the wake of the crisis will depend upon arguably two major uncertainties, although key uncertainties. One is the health response. How will the public and even the private health sector respond and deal with this crisis? Are there enough beds? Are there enough ventilators? And I'm afraid that we have to look at one possible response, and that is essentially an exclusive and ineffective response. As Doris has just pointed out, the country is characterized by widespread poverty. 55%, I think you said, had to try to survive on less than 1,000 rand a month, 12,000 rand a year. And for many millions of people, as we all know, healthcare is, well, is under-resourced.
Yes.
On the other hand, we might have a response which is inclusive and effective. But this will probably be more effective for those living in relative affluence, those who have access to state-of-the-art healthcare. So there's the one response. And this will all have a bearing, obviously, on things such as flattening the curve, postponing the peak. The peak is going to be. The question just is, when exactly will the peak be? We want to postpone that as long as possible to enable the beleaguered healthcare sector to in some way respond effectively. The other important deciding factor will probably be the degree of economic stimulus provided by government and the private sector. And here again, there are two extreme possibilities. One is that that stimulus will be tepid, uninspired, and largely ineffective. And it's interesting that government has announced some very important stimulus measures, but they use the word measures to cushion the economy. We are looking for more than that. We're looking for measures that will really aggressively, audaciously boost the economy. It's interesting that in places like the UK, France, and the USA, they have injected resources totaling 10%, even as much as 20% of their GDP into their economies. Here, so far, we're looking at barely 2%. So we put the two together, typical scenario kind of thinking, and the four quadrants, which you now see in front of you, ought to give us four plausible scenarios. Now, I want to say again that even the most favorable outcome in terms of the economy will embrace or use the word recession. There's a recession facing us. The question is how severe and how it will be and how long it will take to recover from that recession. So the worst possible outcome would be a combination of healthcare or the health response being largely ineffective and the economic stimulus being tepid, giving rise to, I'm quoting here again, Nurini, the possibility of not just a Great Depression and even greater depression. Then we have, moving to the right, a somewhat better health response. It more or less copes with the situation, but the economic stimulus is really not all that exciting, giving rise to a great recession. I'm using the phrase coined 10 years ago, the Great Recession of 10 years ago, although this one might be a bit more profound. Top left-hand side is where the healthcare response, not all that great, not all that effective, but there are some fairly reasonable and meaningful measures instituted by government and the private sector to kind of keep the economy more than just ticking over. That would probably imply a fairly lengthy recovery and a patchy one. Some industries will benefit more than others.
Yeah, for sure.
And finally, we have the possibility of a fairly effective public health response and fairly meaningful economic stimuli, giving rise to the best case scenario, which is not all that great, they were taking us back essentially to where we were 2 months ago, and that wasn't a great place to be. Wishy-washy growth, picking up ever so slightly over the next couple of years, but I say again, not all that exciting. We can use, in some ways, to describe these four scenarios, different letters of the alphabet. So the Greater Depression would be an I-shaped cycle. Imagine the economy plunging downwards, like the letter I, and as I've already said, that would be faster and more severe than the Great Depression. Excuse me, the Great Recession would be a kind of an L-shaped cycle. That is where economic activity plunges downwards and then moves along in a stagnant kind of fashion, leaving behind it some really long-term, almost permanent damage to the labor market, investment, and productivity. Top left-hand side, a lengthy and patchy recovery. This would be the typical idea of a U-shaped recovery. So the economy plunges, it stagnates for quite a while before recovering. But this would leave in its wake loss of output in a number of businesses, permanent loss of output, industries, and also naturally small business sector being particularly compromised. In the final analysis or the final scenario, the so-called V-shaped recovery, so the economy plummets for a year or so and then recovers quite sharply. And that is, as I say, more or less what we were hoping for, or it'd take us back to where we were two or 3 months ago. So I think, Doris, for now, let me summarize by saying that there is no good news. The best we can hope for is a mitigation of the bad news. A recession is undoubtedly on the cards. As you would have seen over the last few days, according to the IMF, economic growth this year in this country, minus 5.8%. The Reserve Bank earlier this week forecasting minus 6.1%. The big question is, when will the recovery come and what will the shape of the recovery be?
Yeah, and I particularly like that unorthodox, audacious, that kind of thinking that could be potentially, because the big narrative that I'm hearing all the time is how do we get it back, or or still instituting measures that we've always had. And I think there's room now for, I don't know yet what it should be, but at least spending time on unorthodox methods and maybe imaginative new ways of creating new paths going forward. Otherwise, we're definitely going to be in serious trouble.
Yes, well, I mean, I personally believe that we need to swallow our pride and look very seriously at the IMF and the World Bank. We don't want, obviously, to avail ourselves of their financing and then have imposed upon us all these conditionalities. But special funds, if you like, earmarked, ring-fenced for dealing with the virus, I think, as I said, we should swallow our pride. Now is not the time to have a fragile ego. The African Development Bank, possibly, or the so-called BRICS Bank. Desperate times call for desperate measures. We need to put aside, as I say, our fragile egos and recognize the fact that because of our own self-imposed fiscal constraints, which we're all aware of, rapidly rising government debt, etc., we haven't got all that many resources to throw at this problem. We need to avail ourselves of different external resources.
Sure. Thanks, Andre. Always nice talking to you.
Sorry, Doris, if I may just add, I think both of us as futurists realize that futurists have to have a dose of optimism.
Optimism. Let's have a bit of optimism.
It's difficult to be too optimistic, but I just would like to point out, just going back to my system here, and moving forward a bit, just give me a chance to get there. I don't want to, but almost there. But before I get to the optimism, perhaps, well, I suppose there's also a semi-optimistic way of looking at it. I remember back, excuse me, just after the so-called Great Recession some 10 years ago, the well-known author Thomas Friedman had this to say. And it struck me that by deleting one or two of the words you used then and replacing them with some new words, maybe these sentiments still hold true. So in front of you, you'll see the way I'm going to rephrase ever so slightly his words. Let's today step out of the normal boundaries of analysis of our economic crisis, let's call it the COVID-19 crisis, and ask a radical question. What if this COVID-19 crisis represents something much more fundamental than simply a deep recession? What if it's telling us that the whole growth model we created in the last 50 years is simply unsustainable economically and ecologically? And that 2020 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said, no more. Take a breather, smell the roses, slow down a bit. So maybe I'm being too naively optimistic, maybe it will serve as a wake-up call for the way we think about and run the economy. Also bear in mind, in South Africa, looking for a few positives, the petrol price is at not an all-time low, of course, but it's much lower than it used to be. And expectations are in the first week of May, it will go down again quite substantially. Ironically, no load shedding in the last few weeks. I say ironically because that is because, of course, of a slowdown in economic activity. And then the Reserve Bank. As we saw, and this is perhaps part of the unorthodox approach I was mentioning a few minutes ago, almost out of the blue, and barely a month after a previous decision, the Reserve Bank decided to lower interest rates again by 1 percentage point. Now, the point I want to make here is that if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, that represents short-term interest rates in the so-called G7 countries. And you will see that they are already at exceptionally low levels, less than 1.5% there, 0.5% there, barely zero there, and even negative interest rates. That means that they have very limited scope in using interest rate policy to kickstart their economies. We do have that scope because of very good management of our monetary affairs in the last few years. Conservative management, interest rates here are still high-ish, or very high by world standards, and the scope is there for further drops, further declines. In fact, the Reserve Bank did suggest the other day that another 5 decreases on the cards over the next year or so. They won't all be 1 percentage point, probably only 0.25%, but nonetheless, we have the scope for lowering interest rates. Many other countries don't have that scope. So in a strange backhanded way, that's also actually, I suppose, a positive, if you like. But we can sugarcoat this as much as we want. And I don't want to use too many exaggerated cliches, but we are in trouble. I must point out that the South African economy entered this crisis in a position of vulnerability.
Yes, we've been in trouble. So it's not just the virus. We've been in trouble, and now it's just sort of getting more.
Yep, I'm afraid so. But the rules are changing every day. The information is changing every day. I think on a very positive side, the policy commitment, the government official policy commitment to dealing with the virus is wonderful. The proof lies in the pudding, the implementation thereof, but the intentions, I think, are the right ones. The ideas are correct. As I say, the challenge is for the infrastructure, as it were, to deal with the intended policy decisions. And of course, the next big thing is the timing of the exit strategy. When do we become liberated from lockdown? Is it going to be phased in? When it's going to happen? Is it the next few weeks, next few months? Who knows? The impact on education, on schools, on businesses, on small businesses. Perhaps my last comment, it's again ironic and even poignant that for so many years we've been saying that the route towards employment is self-employment and small businesses. Yeah. And now we find those are the very ones that are most vulnerable in this current situation.
Yeah.
But I think I've said enough.
It's always good to talk to you, Andre. Thanks so much for this.
It's a pleasure. And good luck and best wishes to everybody out there.
Yes, let's think out clever things, make the economy come back again. Thanks.
Thank you.